First, we want to begin with asking Hashem to send a refuah shalema, and we're learning in the schos of Shalom Dov Ber ben Itasara, Yehuda Leib ben Manya, and Yisrael Yosef ben Devaraleah. They should have a refuah shalema, B'karav mamash b'sech shar chele amcha. We want to wish a great big mazel tov to Chana on a new great grandson born to Chaya and Yair Cohen. We want to mention that Yehudis Edelman's father-in-law's yahrzeit is on Chavdalet Teves, and our dear classmate Jane Marcus's birthday is on Chavdalet Teves. And when I read that, I was like, oh, everything is illuminated. It's all clear. Okay. Va'era, Aleph. Mivur b'divrei Chazal. Chazal explain, Yerushalmi and Psachim, she'arba kaises shetiknu chachamim lishtos belel Pesach, hin keneged arba l'shonos shel geula, that the four cups that the chachamim were metakein, they established that we should drink four cups at the Seder, parallel the four terms surrounding salvation, geula, shenemru b'tchilas parshas ve'era, that are mentioned at the beginning of our parsha. And those are v'hoitzesi, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. And one more, also on Chavdala Teves. Heidi is saying that her mother's yahrzeit is also Chavdala Teves. So we're learning Le'ilu Nishmas.
Chaya Eigner. Sorry, I put the wrong name.
Oh, Chaya. Okay. We outed you. We knew you had an alias. Okay. It
Yeah.
should be Elias Hanashama for your mother.
Um,
So the four terms of salvation, of redemption, that appear at the beginning of our parsha, and I will take you out, and I will save you, and I will redeem you, and I will take you as my nation, that these correspond to, correlate to the four cups of wine that we drink at the Seder. By the way, what's so fantastic about the Sikha is that we can learn a Sikha all about Pesach, and then Pesach is not for a few more months. So it'll put us in the right mind. V'hiksha Mordechai. And the Mordechai asks a shaila, Leboy arba lachmim. Should it not be that to parallel the four terms regarding salvation or redemption, we should eat four matzahs? Haloyachilas matzah belel Pesach hi choiva min hatera. V'tama al shum shenigalu avsinim mitzrayim. After all, the reason we eat matzah is because we were redeemed from Egypt. And eating matzah is a daraisa. It's a biblical commandment. Ve'im kain, and once we establish this, hayamatim yoser l'takin sheyisadar adam al shulchan belel haPesach arba matzahs connected arba l'shonish geula. So the Mordechai says, would it not make more sense? Would it not be more proper that we should take four matzahs? And that's midaraisa, and that would be the best way to evoke all of the concepts and all of the spiritual and celestial lights that have to do with the four types of redemption, or the four terms correlate with redemption. The Kasav Mordechai, and the Mordechai writes about this. He responds to this question. Lekach yesh meforshim keneged daled kaises hamurim liyeshua v'chulei. So the Mordechai says that there are some meforshim that say, the reason why it's not four matzahs, but rather it's four cups of wine, because in Tehillim there are four references to a cup of salvation. The most famous that we're all familiar with is the one that's embedded in Havdalah, Kais Yeshuas Eso V'Shem Hashem Ekra. But there are three other references in Tehillim that twin the idea of a kais, of a cup, and the energy of salvation. Hainu sha'ashe'ela hamura hitamam shal yeshem mefarshim. Sha'akaises hein keneged dalet kaises hamurim liyeshua, v'zeh ein shayach b'lechem. So the Mordechai says that that there are mefarshim that that explain that we have 4 cups of wine at the Seder because there's reference to salvation, and it is mentioned with a cup of salvation. And so, therefore, we do 4 cups of wine at the Seder because that's not shayach, that's not relevant to lechem, to bread. In this case, we're talking about matzah. But the Rebbe says, but first of all, this explanation doesn't really reconcile the question according to all opinions. ובפרט לפי הטעם בעדי הנ"ל שהביא רבינו זקן להלכה בשולחן ערוך, שארבע כוסות הן כנגד ארבע לשוני של גאולה. And especially, according to what the Alter Rebbe wrote in his Shulchan Aruch, he wrote that the 4 cups of wine correlate to the 4 terms of Geula, of redemption, that are in this parsha. And he doesn't say anything about it being correlated or linked with the idea of cups. So the Rebbe said there has to be more here. Okay? So our question is, what's up with the 4 terms at the beginning of our parsha that deal with redemption being expressed, and they come down in tangible form in 4 cups of wine rather than in 4 matzahs? Beis. V'hinei hadinhu shetzarech lito l'seder Pesach shloish matzahs. So first the Rebbe says that we have a halacha that we have to have 3 matzahs for the Seder. V'tam hadavar. And what's the reason that we need 3 matzahs? Because we need shtei shleimas liftzoi alein kamei b'shar yom tov. Because we need 2 complete matzahs to break bread, to begin the meal, as it were, like we do every Shabbos and Yom Tov. V'oid prusa achas mishum lechem oini. And then we need 1 more piece of matzah, which represents the bread of affliction or the bread of impoverishment. Another reason given for why 3 matzahs. Mitam naisav shekasav Mordechai. The Mordechai writes another reason, that it represents or it parallels shloish matzahs lezecher lach meiteda. That there are a number of things that we do at the Seder that have to do with various karbanos that were brought, sacrifices that were brought, and the 3 matzahs kind of either evoke the memory of or parallel 3 types of unleavened bread that accompanied the various sacrifices that were brought in the Beis Hamikdash. Olahisif, and to add, because everything in Torah is very, very specific. Mistaber loymar, it's logical to say shegam ha-mispor de sholish matzahs, that also the number 3 for the matzahs ain't rak mitzat tam study. Ella b'doime lemispar ha-kaises gam inin hashayach l'teichen v'tam achilas matzah bechlal. Okay, this was something that the Rebbe taught us over and over again in Sichos, that yeah, it's true that we have these reasons for why 3 matzahs, why 4 cups of wine. But don't be satisfied with that, because it's not random. And it's not even like, okay, this is going to symbolize something that was in the temple times, or this symbolizes something written in the Torah. No.
And go to Levaya, then
there is an inherent connection between the concept of matzah and 3, and the number 3. There is an inherent connection between wine and the number 4. Okay, now this is a chiddush in the Rebbe's Torah. So it's worth absorbing and appreciating that. Okay, so the Rebbe is going to delve into the numbers 3 and 4, and what the energy of matzah is and what the energy of wine is. And then, of course, he is going to show us how this expresses itself in the idea of 3 avos, 4 imahos, female, male, etc. Okay. So, Valpizer Nimtza. So once we So he says that we have to understand that it's not because of a side reason, but it's inyan hashayach l'teichen v'tam achilas matzah bechlal. But the number 3 correlates to the overarching theme and reason for eating matzah, which is al shum shenigalu avosenu mimitzrayim. It's because our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt. And based on this, we find that in the redemption from Egypt, there are 2 dimensions, or there are 2 facets. Aleph, inyan hamorkav mishloisha pratim. There is an energy and there is a concept in the redemption from Egypt that is comprised of 3 dimensions. The inyan zeh shebekulas Mitzrayim misbate bechilas matzah, and this 3-dimensional aspect of redemption from Egypt is expressed through eating matzah. And that's why we need 3 matzahs at the Seder. And then there's another aspect of Geula, inyan hamorkav me'arba pratim. And then there's the 4-dimensional aspect of redemption, arba l'shayna shel Geula, which correlates with the 4 terms in our parsha for redemption. U'kenegdam tiknu arba kaises. And it is parallel to this 4-dimensional aspect of redemption that we drink 4 cups of wine. Gimel. V'yesh loymar habir bazeh. And we might say that the explanation is as follows. Yedua hamivor b'sfarim. It is well known what is explained in various holy Sfarim. Shebashas Yitzias Mitzrayim Leihayu b'nei Yisrael ru'uyim l'geula. That at the time of redemption from Egypt, the Jews were not deserving of redemption. Va'ad kedei kach, and so much so was this the case. She'ilu nish'aru oid rega achad b'Mitzrayim. If they would have remained one more moment in Mitzrayim, they would have been completely mired. They would have completely sunk into the impurity of Egypt. And we know that there were Chamishim Sharei Tuma. There are 50 gates or 50 levels or strata of impurity. And they had sunk to the 49th. Ella, shekeheref ayin haitzim HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitumas Mitzrayim. But what happened? In a blink of an eye, God took them out of the impurity of Egypt. Nigla aleim melech malchi amlachem HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'ga'alam. The King of all kings revealed himself and redeemed them. We might say, and now we're in a position to understand that the truth of the matter is that the completion, that the fullness of the redemption only actually occurred and manifested when we received the Torah at Sinai. And we see this in the 4 terms regarding redemption in our parsha, that the 4th term about redemption, the last one, is v'lakachti eschem li la'am, and I will take you to me as a nation. Shechein tachlis ushleimus geulas Mitzrayim hiyetzias b'nei Yisrael b'shleimus mitumas Mitzrayim. Because Geulas Mitzrayim, the redemption from Egypt, only comes to fruition, only comes to completion. They only leave the impurity of Mitzrayim with becoming God's nation. And this process unfolded or unfurled in the 49 days between leaving Egypt and receiving the Torah. So much so that when they arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, they were already deserving of the appellation of the description, a holy nation. And now we could begin to explore the difference between matzah and wine or cups. Hamatzah madgisha schools Mitzrayim k'fi sheba loy kol kach mitzad avodas Yisrael ela ba'ofen shel b'loshen haggadah matzah zu she'anu oichlim al shum shelo hispik b'tzeker shel avosenu lahachmitz ad shenigla aleim melech malchim lach HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'go'alam mitzad HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sorry, just wanted to get that all out, and I'll explain that matzah really underscores Hashem's actions regarding the redemption. Not so much the spiritual service of the Jews, but rather, as we say in the Haggadah, that this matzah that we eat because the dough of our forefathers and our foremothers did not have a chance to rise. In other words, it all happened so quickly that Hashem revealed himself and that he redeemed them. It was all really mitzad HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was all God's work. It was all an initiation from above. It was all about the producer. It was all an overlay. Hamatzah remezes l'chipazayin. The matzah hints.
Yeah, but Rivky, we also matzah is connected with the emunah of Bnei Yisrael. That's why it's michla the mehemenusa.
That's true, but that's not what the Rebbe is focusing on in this sicha. And you could, that's true, 100%. But you could also say that even that is mitzad HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu invested in them this emunah that was necessary, and that's why they had to eat matzah before they left Egypt. This reason that we give for why we eat matzah, that really is this. The Rebbe has a lot of sikhs about this. That's the second type of matzah. That's after they left, but they had to eat matzah Mitzrayim, and this matzah put in them this emunah that they should be able to follow Hashem out of Mitzrayim, and so this is also from the producer. This is also mitzad HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's like a spiritual drug dispensed from above. So matzah remezes l'chipazon shahaya be'ez ha'geula. The matzah alludes to the haste, the alacrity that was the energy of this redemption. Lo hispik b'tzeker shel avosenu lahachmitz. So much so that their dough couldn't even rise. Hachipazon lo haitis b'nei Yisrael mitumas Mitzrayim. This is all about the haste, and it says about when we leave this gullus immediately. It says loy b'chipazon. We will not run. It will not be in haste. But Mitzrayim was in haste. And that's why matzah has to be bread of impoverishment, meaning very poor ingredients, nothing that enriches it. And the Rebbe says, Ein ani ela b'das. And true indigence, true poverty, is about a paucity of knowledge. Ein ani ela b'das. The true poor person is the one who doesn't have das, does not have cognition. And this is zecher l'matzav ha'anius b'kedusha v'tahara. And
hello. I still have an issue with that because the whole inyan of why it's called Chag HaPesach, Chag HaMatzos Pesach, is the Eibishter's Meile, Matzos is the Yidden's Meile, the Eibishter's Meshabeach Yidden, because of the
respect for the
Emunah.
recording, we're going to have to keep the comments till after the class or in the chat. I'm sorry. I was biting my tongue, but we are recording and posting this.
Okay. Thank you, Tzippa. Thank you, Hindi. I'll just say that I think here is the Indian of what it says in Chassidus, Sevenzer v'umeret. Everything is about the context. Everything you're saying is true, but it's not what the Rebbe's bring out in this Sikha. But that's the beauty. It's like a diamond, and you turn it this way, you see this cut, you see this color, and it's all part of one large gem. Okay, so the Rebbe says that is for this reason that matzah has to be made of very simple, like poor ingredients, and it is an allusion to the true poverty, which is a poverty of knowledge and a poverty of spiritual stature. It is zecher lematzav hanias b'kedusha v'tahara. It reminds us of their poverty in terms of holiness and purity. Ubepashtos, and simply speaking, lechem she'ein boitam kechametz kematz ashira. And let's get real. This constipating cracker has no taste, like regular bread or even enriched matzah. Shechein tam moira al inyan sheyesh la'adam arivos v'tainug ba. The term ta'am, which means taste, is also, of course, the Hebrew reason for reason, the Hebrew word for reason. And when something lacks taste, then we're talking about something that doesn't give a person sweetness and pleasure. What gives people sweetness and pleasure? Either because it's something that a person can embrace with their cognition, like we say, it makes sense. So we feel a certain satisfaction, a certain pleasure. Or it vivifies you, it excites you emotionally. And because the redemption from the impurity of Egypt came from above, and it wasn't something that was produced by Bnei Yisrael, it didn't come because of their preparations. They didn't plan the Geula. They didn't execute the Geula. They didn't sit in any meetings about the Geula. It all came from above. Move on. It's understood. So they didn't have this satisfaction of tasting it in a way in which you invest yourself. You get it. It resonates, whatever term you want to use. Like it says, Avodim hayinu lefara b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And the Gemara says, Va'avda behefkera nichalei. A slave always prefers lack of restraint. All they want is freedom, which means in this context, the Rebbe is saying that a slave is so besotted with the idea of freedom that they can't undertake any disciplines that would bring them to a higher level spiritually or even cognitively. Or, in other words, to accomplish anything, you actually have to take on discipline. You want to become a musician, you want to train for a marathon, whatever you want to accomplish, it takes discipline. But a slave, because of where they are in their servitude, all they want, the Gemara says, is to be hefker. All they want is to be free of all constraints. And the next day, on Tesva of Nisan, and even for some time after, and when we learn the sikha surrounding what happened to Egel Hazav, it becomes clear that even after the receiving the Torah at Har Sinai, but there still remained with them the evil and the impurity of Mitzrayim. In other words, they left Egypt, but Egypt had not completely left them. And like the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, Sheborach ha'am. Why did they run away? I still remember my second grade teacher explaining how Para came out in the middle of the night in his pajamas with a pom-pom on his pajama hat. I had never seen anyone wear a pajama hat, but this is what we were taught. And he begged Moshe to take the Jews out of Egypt. So why did they have to run? They weren't escaping. They were actually being asked to leave. The Alter Rebbe explains, "Heim borchu mimitzrayim, hainu sheyatu min hara b'derech eskafia mitzad kabbalas ol." They had to flee, not because they understood the danger of remaining, but because they left with Kabbalah Sa'ol. They accepted upon themselves the yoke of heaven that Hashem said they have to leave. Masha Enkain, but in contradistinction, Hayayin, but when you talk about wine, Sheyesh Beitam Ba'arivos. Wine has a taste, wine has a sweetness, wine has a bouquet, etc., etc. Ad shehu ma'arer shira eitela adam hashayse mimeno. Like it says in the Gemara, Ein omer shira ela al hayayin. Wine has taste, it has dimension, it does something to the person. It evokes song. It evokes expression. So much so that the Gemara says that you don't say Shira, you don't thank God, you don't laud God, you don't sing to God, except for on a cup of wine, which is why we bench over a cup of wine, etc. Harehu, zecher legeula ulecherus. Okay, now look at what the Rebbe is doing here. Geula means redemption. Cherus means freedom. You could be redeemed and still not be free. Okay? But the wine speaks about Geula ucherus. Gam kefi sheniskay masavsev b'poel b'vnei Yisrael. It speaks to how this actually came to expression in the Jews, after they did the work, they did the work. And this is work that has to come from the inside out. It cannot be superimposed. It cannot be an overlay. And it's incremental, and it takes time, and it takes work. And so the yayin speaks to what the Jews ultimately did to purge themselves of the evil of Mitzrayim. Dalet. So now we're in a position to further appreciate the difference between 3 and 4. 3 correlating to matzahs, 4 correlating to the cups of wine. So as the Rebbe already kind of alluded to very quickly, but here he's going to take it apart, that when you look at the 4 terms of redemption, there is a marked difference between the first 3 terms, the first 3 expressions regarding redemption, and the last, the 4th. The first 3 expressions, and I will take you out from beneath the subjugation of Egypt, and I will save you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with outstretched hands, and with great miracles and wonders. Hein in Yane Geula Sheiru Tekef Be'ez Yitzias Mitzrayim. These are aspects of the redemption that happened immediately upon leaving Egypt. Kevan Shabo Milmaila Canal, because they all came from above, as was said previously. Masha Enkein Ha'inyan Haravi, but the 4th dimension was different. V'lakachti eschem li la'am. The 4th is, I am going to take you to me as a nation. The Rebbe points out, you're going to push back and you're going to say, well, it's also on the part of the producer, on the part of God. It says, and I will take you. But the Rebbe says, even though Hashem says, I will take you for a nation, this is also an overture from above. Harei hu talui bi Yisrael. But it's dependent on the Jews. A relationship connotes 2 people entering into an alliance of their own volition. Okay, over here we're not 2 people, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But this is the audacious linchpin of Jewish theology, that Hashem needs, kavyachal, us, to choose. So even though Hashem V'lakachti harehu tolui b'Yisrael. But Hashem's taking us as a people is dependent on us. Sha'aleim lehe asais ru'im lehi la'am. We have to be deserving of being God's nation. And this was completed only at Matan Torah, as said above. And that's why matzah appears in the number 3. They parallel the first 3 terms about redemption. Because matzah underscores the redemption in the way that it comes from God, okay, from above. In contradistinction, the cups of wine. And the wine is correlated with the redemption on the part of the Jews through their work. Therefore, it appears in the number 4, which includes the 4th term, and I will take you as a nation. And for this very reason, rak achilas matzah hi min haTorah. So halachically, only eating matzah is from the Torah. Mitzrayim lel Pesach, because when you look at objectively what happened in Yetzias Mitzrayim, in leaving Egypt, on that night, ira bepoel hageula milmayla bavad. So practically speaking, what happened was the redemption from above. Hashem swooped in, lo yaldei malach, lo yaldei saraf, not through any deputy, and took them out. And those are shloshis inyanim harishonim. And those are the first 3 things. The first 3 terms. Okay? So we could stop here, and we would still have learned a lot. But the Rebbe says in Sif A, ba'omek yoser, but now to go deeper, yesh loimer, we might say, sheyeshayches pnimis bein hamatzah v'akoysa shol yayin lemisparim shalahem shlosh v'arba. Now we're going to go to the reason, the inner dimension, pnimius hatayr chasidus, on the correlation between matzah and 3 and wine and 4. Hachiluk bein hamisporim shlosh v'arba muvan al pimayim chazal b'negei la'is gimel v'dalet. The difference between the numbers 3 and 4 could be understood based on what the Gemara teaches about the letters, the 3rd and 4th letter in the Aleph Beis, the Gimel and the Dalet. And the Gemara says about this, Gimel Dalet, Gemel Dalim. Kalaimar. What does this mean? Gimel, the letter Gimel, also the word, but we're going to stick with the Secha. Miramezes al goimel noisein. Okay, Gimel alludes to the idea of giving. Gimilas chasadim, kindness. Dalit, and the letter Dalit alludes to dal, an impoverished person, a poor person, a mekabel, the one who receives. And this concept also expresses itself in the numbers 3 and 4. So regarding Aleph Beis, and here is not the time and the place, but there's the way we understand the shape of the letter and how it correlates with the name of the letter and the numeric value of the letter. Okay, so he says that this idea of giving and receiving is also alluded to in the numbers 3 and 4. How? Hahashpa'a ba'oida etzel hamashpia hanoisein morkeves mishloish bechines. When there is affluence, when there is something that the giver, that the initiator wants to give to somebody else, but it's still in their domain. That energy, that wisdom, whatever it is that is going to be transmitted, is comprised of 3 dimensions. Okay, so in Hasidus, it's Chachma, Bina, and Zah. It's the initial flash of understanding. It's the exposition thereof. It's the development of that concept. And then it's the way that it comes down in the first 6 meters. So those are the 3 dimensions when it's still in the domain of the mashpia. And when that transmission reaches the receiver, the recipient, then there's a 4th dimension that enters the equation, and that is the shetach v'kli hamakabel. It is the realm and the vessel that the recipient offers. Rebbe says that this 4th dimension of transmission exists already in the one who's going to transmit, but it's obscured until the transmission actually occurs. And in the brackets, the Rebbe is going to give to flesh out like kind of an example for understanding this. Al derech mashal, the Rebbe says, like take for example, ha'oisios, hamabiyos dvar sechel. Think about the letters that express a cognitive thought, okay? Because we think in words. That means there have to be letters that the thoughts have to filter down into and be vested in. Okay, so he says that kol haskala yeshla oisis shebehen hi milubeshes. Every idea. Give me a second, Sarah. Okay, I'll get back to that. Remind me. Every idea has letters in which it has to be vested. It has to come down in letters. Ulam bidvar haseichel atzmai. However, in the initial thought, b'terem masiga adam b'chli sichlai, before a person really grasps it with their cognition, ein ha'oisios nikares, the letters are not yet recognized. Ela murgash hateichen or haseichel. What you're feeling, what you're understanding, what's kind of embracing you is the raw idea rather than the words in which the idea is going to be expressed. It's only when the idea is received and is integrated into the cognitive tools of a person, then you begin to recognize and the letters begin to be revealed. You know how people will say, I need to formulate my thought. Because the thought itself can be overwhelming and all suffusing, and you need to actually formulate it so you can articulate it, so you can express it. But before there are letters, before there are words, before there are the kalim, the vessels, there's just the or. There's just the light. There's just the raw and untrammeled idea. So the Rebbe says that the 4th dimension is the way in which it gets transmitted to the Mekabel. So once we understand that 3 is about transmission, 4 is about what happens in the transmission between the initiator and the receiver. Okay, so there are 3 dimensions that are in the let's say in the shetach, in the field, in the realm of the transmitter, and only when it comes to articulating it to the one who's going to get it, that's when the fourth dimension kicks in. And this is also one of the explanations for the difference between the Avos and the Imahis. We have 3 patriarchs and 4 matriarchs. And I don't want to digress here, but Hindi, if you take a look at the footnote, you'll see that the Rebbe says that elsewhere in Hasidus, it says the opposite. That the R is 4 dimensions and the Kalim are 3 dimensions. But right here, right now, the Rebbe is saying the iris are 3, the Kalim are correlated with 4. Hatayr av v'eim misyaches lahashpa'asam haledes banim ubanis. You can best understand the concept of father and mother, of course, as it relates to what they give forth, children. Umehachilukim shebeineim bahashpa. And if you drill down and you look at the difference in the roles between father and mothers in what they give forth, b'tipas hashpaz ha'av evari havlad klulim behelem gadol. So in the seminal drop, in the father's contribution, all of the limbs of the child are all there, they're all included, but greatly obscured, greatly shrouded. Ve'ilu ha'eim maitzi asay l'dei gilui b'leidas avlat shalim. And it's through the process of gestation that happens in the mother that all of the aspects of the child become revealed. Kilaymar, this is to say, mitzad ha'av hamashpia, from the perspective of the father, the initiator, hadavar hamushba havlad adayin eina b'tzir gilui. What's being transmitted from the father is not a revealed construct. Gilui hashpa o b'poel mamish b'chliya mekabel hu al yedei ha'ein. The revelation of that complete transmission, practically speaking, happens from the mother. And that's why we have 3 patriarchs. That's why the idea of the patriarchy is correlated with the number 3. Hashem could have made it that we would have had Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Gedaliah. But the Indian is not that, the Indian is because father is correlated with the number 3. Because when you're talking about what's being given forth from the perspective of father, when it's still within it, like included within him, this is comprised of 3 dimensions. But in contradistinction, the mothers, bechinas mekabel, which is the idea of receiving, hein b'mispar arba. With the reception kicks in the 4th aspect. And I mean, there's so much to speak here, but we try not to editorialize. But just 2 things very quickly. There's so much Chassidus Maimurim about like a spiritual type of acid reflux. Okay, so like it's when the 3rd dimension is forced to confront, to transmit, that the 4th dimension ricochets backwards to the initiator. The 4th dimension is teased out by the receiver, but then think about it, who is really receiving? The alleged mashpia is really receiving that 4th dimension from the alleged receiver. So now the mekabel became the mashpia. that's one thing to think about, and that's constantly happening in any paradigm of Mashpia Makabel. And there was another thing I wanted to. Oh, Sarah asked earlier about where's Das. So I don't know enough Hasidus to answer this properly. So if somebody else can, please do. But from what I'm understanding, Da'as kickstarts Za, and then the fourth dimension is Malchus. So there's Chachma Bina, and then Das is connected knowledge, the way in which it already begins to interact with Za. It's consciousness. It's
From my
when it
understanding,
becomes real.
I'm sorry, it's the amygdala, I think, that connects to the spine, because Za is the spine.
Okay, thank you. That's a great image. Thank you so much. Vav. And so it was with the leaf taking from Egypt. Beg'ulas Mitzrayim kefi sheba milmayla haisa klula b'koyach kol ha'geula b'shleimusa. So in the redemption, in the way that it came from above, it already included the energy for the complete redemption. Gam ha'geula kefi sheba la'achrei zeh l'dei gilui b'poel b'matan Torah, inclusive of how it would unfurl and crescendo with the giving of the Torah. Ela shehadavar hayakayim ba behelem, but it was still hidden. It was shrouded. So just like that drop of semen includes everything that is going to be developed later, but of course in hidden, shrouded manner. The same thing in the redemption from Mitzrayim, it already included everything that was going to happen later. And now we're circling back to better understand the difference between matzah and wine. Matzah and the 4 cups of wine. Kiyum hazecher legeula ulecheres mitzad haTorah shebechsav musar avicha. There is the way in which we have to remember the geula and the redemption and the freedom mitzad Torah shebechtav. Biblically, that is the mitzvah matzah. And that is correlated with, because Shlomo HaMelech said, Shma b'ni musar avicha, va'al titesh teres imecha. King Solomon says, listen, my son, to the admonishment of your father, and do not forget the Torah of your mother. So the Rebbe says that Torah shebechsav correlates with musar avicha, mashpia. This is the male modality of Torah. Mashpia. This matgish as a geula kafishi mitzad HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this underscores and showcases the redemption from the perspective and through the overtures of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'lachenu na'aseh al yidei achilas matzah. And that's why practically it expresses itself through eating matzah, which I have already explained is tasteless because it's not about our input. We didn't create the geula, we didn't plan it, we didn't execute it, we had no input. Tasteless. And also, b'mispar shalish, and that's why we eat 3 matzahs. Sharei hashpa, ba'oida klula b'mashpia, murkeves mishloish b'chinas kanal. Because as hashpa, as effluent is still within the mashpia, it's comprised only of 3 dimensions. Ulam chachamim, but then when you get the sages, Torah sheba'al peh, the oral Torah, which is correlated with Torah's imecha. This is the Torah of your mother. This is the Torah of the Mekabel. Haisifu v'tiknu shahazecher legeula l'cheres chayav liyos gam ba'ofen sha'adam yachush as a geula kafi shehi mitzad Mekabel b'nei Yisrael. So then when you're talking about what the rabbis added, what the sages established, that we have to remember the redemption and the freedom, and that has to be in a way where the person can taste and feel what that geula is, mitzad hamikabel, how it feels on the part of the receiver, on the part of Klal Yisrael. V'lachein, and therefore, hadavar nasa. So this mitzvah of remembering Egypt happens, aleph, shtiyas yayin sheish beitam. It happens through drinking wine, which does have a taste, a very, very delicious taste, and ubemispar arba dafka. And it happens with 4, the 4th dimension, Zayin. Al pi habir hanal b'tam l'kicha shlosh matzos, yesh lahasbir gam davar tamua shematzinu b'negei lamatzah. Once we understand this, now we can better understand a strange, maybe, or surprising little wrinkle or fact about matzah in halacha. And that is, hadinhu, the halacha is, bala matzah yatza. If you just swallow matzah, I don't know how one does that, but if you just swallow matzah, you don't chew it, you don't taste it, you fulfill the commandment to eat matzah. Because ein chiyuv sheyargish adam es tam hamatzah. There is no obligation on a person to feel, to register the taste of the matzah. Ella, kol zman shekiyim achilas matzah afilu b'derech blia yatsa yudei chavasai. As long as a person ingested it somehow, they fulfilled their. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm not talking about like my, I don't know, you being shot up with matzah. But if you somehow swallowed it and you got it into your system, then you fulfilled your obligation. And the Rebbe says, like, compare and contrast that. Masha came b'morar. Think about the bitter herbs. She'ein adam yotzi chayvas ad chayvasai. A person does not fulfill their obligation. At sheyargish tam mirirasai bepiv. Person does not fulfill the obligation until you feel the bitterness in your mouth. On the other hand, so here comes like the surprising wrinkle, hadinhu she'ein adam yotzi de chavasei b'matzah mivushelas. On the other hand, the halacha is that you do not fulfill your obligation with wine, with matzah that's cooked. Va'afilu loy b'matzah shenishrasa b'mei peres. And even you can't fulfill your obligation with matzah that's soaked in some kind of juice. Because although you don't have an obligation to taste the matzah in your mouth, that's on one hand, mikol makayim, but still in all, hamatzah atzma tzarech sheyeh tam matzah. But the matzah itself has to have a taste of matzah. So if you cook it, it's going to taste different. If you rinse it, not rinse. If you soak it in fruit juice, it's not going to taste like matzah. And the taste can't become obscured in or adulterated by some other taste. Ve'ena muvan. And this is not understood. A lot of the commentary ask about this. Once you understand that there's no obligation when you eat matzah to actually taste it, lama b'matzah atzma tzarich liyos tamatzah. So then, why do you have to retain the pristine taste of the matzah if you have no obligation to taste the taste? You don't have an obligation to taste the taste, but you can't do anything to the matzah itself that will in any way compromise what matzah tastes like. What's the reason? The Rebbe says, "V'habira pnimi bazeh." There are a lot of things, actually, in halacha that you can't understand unless you understand the Chassidus. A lot of sichos like that. Masha b'matzah achilas matzah ein hechrosh tam matzah hurak mitzad gavra. Because, okay, so let me just say that in halacha, two things have to be kept in mind, or two things have to be adjudicated, or two things have to be in the equation. There has to be the gavra and the chefza. Gavra is the person who's fulfilling the mitzvah, and chefza is what you're fulfilling it with. Okay. Now, there's a whole category of mitzvahs that it's about the gavra, meaning that every person is obligated to do those mitzvahs. Then there's a category of chefza, which is if you have that thing, then you're obligated to do such and such with it. If you have a field, then you have to be attentive to all the agricultural laws of the Torah. If you don't have a field, then you have no obligation to do leket and shikha and peya and so on and so forth. Okay, so gavra and chefza. And then there are mitzvahs, of course, that have both components. So actually, every mitzvah has both components. The question is just how you're approaching it. Where's the chiyuv? Where's the obligation? So the Rebbe says like this. The fact that when you eat matzah, there's no obligation, there's nothing that compels you to taste the matzah, but this is on the part of the gavra. This is on the part of the person who is fulfilling this mitzvah. Lefi she'etzel b'nei Yisrael. And this represents the experience of geula of Klal Yisrael. Geulas Mitzrayim sheba milmayla he inyan she'ein lahem boi tam kanal. Because as we said above, the whole Yetzias Mitzrayim was a production. It was produced by God. And Bnei Yisrael, even though, such an interesting thing, because even though they experienced it, but they were passive. It's almost like they had an out-of-body experience and they were watching the movie. So it's an Indian that the Rebbe says, spiritually speaking, has no tam, because they're not invested, because they didn't plan this and they didn't execute it and they were not active in it. So it's like something that has no taste. They did it Kabbalah soul. They followed Hashem out. Ulefichach, and therefore, masha muchrach hu rak achilas matzah. So the halacha showcases this aspect of the geula. The halacha reflects this. All you got to do is eat it. You don't have to taste it. I'm not looking for your feedback if you like it or you don't like it. How it felt on your taste buds. Just have to eat it. Okay, this is happening to you. Therefore, leficha masha muchrach rak achilas matzah. Ba'ifin shetehei dam ubasar kivzarei. It has to become ingested in your system. It has to become part of your flesh and blood. Hainu shahageula tisatzim ima etzem shel hanigal. Okay, this is like amazing. Shahageula tisatzim ima etzem shel hanigal. That the redemption should become part of the essence of the one who was redeemed. You didn't do it, but it has to become part of your system. But it's not necessarily that you're actually going to taste what you're eating. Not necessarily are you going to feel the taste, the pleasure of the matzah, of the redemption. But on the part of the object, tzivoy Hashem sheyotzares hamatzias the mitzvahs matzah. But Hashem commanded this thing called matzah and this mitzvah. Hainu mitzad HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the perspective of Hashem, nitan b'geula zu hakayach lahamid es b'nei Yisrael b'matzav shebo yigalu gam mitzad mitziusam heim mitumas mitzrayim. Okay, this is like unbelievable what the Rebbe is saying here. That in this mitzvah that Hashem created, matzah. Okay, so this is actually, matzah is actually neshama food. It's actually soul food. It's the only food that's actually Jewish food. Bagels, blintzes, lox, schmears. Obviously, that's all cultural. But the one religious food we have is matzah. And the Rebbe says about it that in ingesting it, it gave them the koyach to be able to be redeemed even in their state of constraint. Gam mitzad mitziusam heim. They were so lacking. They were so naked and divested of spiritual clothing or tools or whatever term you want to use. But the matzah gave them the power to be able to experience and be redeemed even from within their own frailty and failings and foibles. Even within all of that, they were able to be redeemed. And therefore, the chefza, this precious object, matzah, that can't be adulterated. That cannot be compromised. You can't cook it. You can't soak it in fruit juice. It has to remain matzah in all of its potency. The geula itself, even though it's l'mayla mitam vadas, it didn't come from the cognition and the understanding and the buy-in of the Jews who were redeemed, but it has to include it. But practically speaking, it was only by Matan Torah that Bnei Yisrael were able to tap into this. They were able to appreciate it. But just like the semen of the father has to include everything that is going to develop during gestation and come to fruition in birth, so this concept of the Jews being able to appreciate and actively taste redemption, this was already included in what Hashem did at the beginning, but it was obscured. Ein adam yesi de echilas matzah ella belechem oini v'loi matzah ashira. And still in all, a person could only fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah with the impoverished bread, the tasteless bread, not with enriched matzah. Hainu, meaning, shatam sheyeshnu, ushamuchach liyais b'matzah gufa, hu ach v'rak tam matzah. There has to be a taste, as the Rebbe explains, but ach v'rak, only the taste of matzah. It can't include sweetness and pleasure that comes from something other than matzah. Like in rich matzah that has oil, that has eggs, etc., etc. And what does this all mean as it is perceived and understood in our spiritual service? Tam matzah, the taste of matzah here, koi, it refers to ha'arivos va'onek sheyesh b'kabbalas ol. Okay, so it's like a plot twist at the very end. Kabbalas ol is without tam, right? We always understand that Kabbalas ol is doing things even though you don't understand it. It doesn't taste good, but Hashem said, you do it. But the Rebbe says that there has to be the sweetness and the pleasure that comes from Kabbalas ol. Lo mitzad hadas, not because you understand it, and it resonates with you, and now you feel all calibrated and aligned, and you're starting to levitate. But the pleasure comes from the lechem aini, from the impoverished bread that is bereft of taste and dimension and bouquet and whatever else. Kolaimar, that is to say, this is not a pleasure that comes from cognition or from our emotive aspect, that will lead us to the pleasure that comes from taste. But this brings us to a level where we take pleasure from the Kabbalah's oil. It's a remarkable concept. And you could shut the recording now. Thank you, Tzippa. Thank you so much for this, and always.